Hi everybody, I'm doing my presentation on the history of Linux, so let's just dive right in. So I wanted to start off with some key contributors. I'm going to reference these people and groups throughout the presentation, so we'll start with Torvalds. He was the one that developed the kernel of Linux while he was in college, and then Stallman developed the utilities for Linux in a project called the GNU project. And the acronym actually stands for GNU, not Unix, which we'll get a little bit more into about Unix, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But Torvalds and Stallman, they're basically the two creators of Linux. They combined their separate work to create Linux. And Stallman also created the Free Software Foundation, and we'll get more into that later too. And then the third group is hobbyist developers. They contributed actually a lot to the growth of Linux, and that's thanks to the free software movement. So, a little bit about Linux, I just wanted to include a couple basic facts. So, Tux is the mascot of Linux, the penguin. He was inspired by a time that a penguin bit Torvald's finger at an Australian zoo, so I found that to be a fun fact. And his name is Tux because Torvalds took the T from Torvalds and the U and X from Unix and created Tux with it. It's open source, we'll get into that. Both the GUI and the CLI are commonly used, and many operating systems use or offer both to the general user, but Linux is one of the fewer operating systems where they're both commonly used. And then distributions, they're basically different versions where the kernel is the same, but the components like the programs and the tools differ by distribution. And then Linux has actually over 600 distributions. And then community, the Unix and Linux Stack Exchange is basically a Q&A discussion board for more advanced users. So Linux has become, a community has come together over Linux, and that's thanks to the open source quality of it. And then its importance in the cybersecurity industry. This is because many of its tools are built specifically for a cybersecurity industry, depending on the version or the distro. But so it's helpful in analyzing. Its CLI has specific commands that are built for that. So that's why it is prominent in this field. So the intent behind Linux, it was originally created as an alternative to Unix and Minix. So Unix was another popular operating system that was almost the first of its kind, and that's because it was portable, and this means that it could both move from and outlive its hardware. So one of my sources said that Unix was based around three main principles, portability being one of them, and then also clarity and simultaneity, the other two. And so that was Unix. Stallman based his part of Linux off of Unix, and then Torvalds based his part off of Minix. He was just frustrated with the licensure involved with Minix, and that's why Linux is open source. These two parties had this kind of mutual idea of accessibility and community. Although they were separate projects for some time, they came together and built Linux. So the origins and development. In 1991, Torvalds, in his quote, he posted to some website, quote, "Just a hobby, won't be big and professional like GNU," which was Stallman's project. And they had no idea at the time, of course, that they would be working together on Linux. But he had no idea it would become what it is today. So in 1992, it became open source under the general public license, which was a document that Stallman wrote and attached to the software saying that it has to be open source, which I'll define open source later. So they combined with the GNU project, and then more versions and distributions were released over the years. I gave a couple of the most prominent ones, most notable, and then with every new version, that was released. More compatibility with different hardware and availability on multiple types of processing systems helped it to be more widespread. And then 1999 and 2000, tech companies recognized its potential. So a couple examples of this: IBM joined forces with Red Hat, and then they also invested $1 billion into the development of Linux in general, which was a big deal. That kind of propelled them forward. And then also Dell started pre-installing Linux on select servers. And then 2005, the creation of Git, which I'll talk about a little bit. So, impact on the open source software movement. This is kind of the main idea of Linux. This is why it was created. Open source means to freely use, modify, and distribute the kernel. So the GNU project and the establishment of the Free Software Foundation was kind of the start of this social movement. Open source had been a thing before, but this is what made it more popular. Free Software Foundation was Stallman's organization foundation that he created to kind of open people up to this idea of open source and help it be more adopted. So Stallman actually resigned from MIT to found the GNU project, and so he was obviously passionate about the concepts of accessibility and transparency. And then the general public license, which is the document that he wrote, opened the door to this whole movement. And there was some original resistance to this social movement. It was called free software before it was called open source software. And the general public, I guess, just rejected the term free. And once they changed the term from free to open source, they kind of liked the idea a little bit more, and it helped it to be more widely adopted. And then Git also played a role in this, which was Torvalds' creation. Git is a distributed version control system that tracks versions of files, and it is used to manage source code development in collaborative projects. So this kind of revolves around the idea of security, and Git is now widely used in all sorts of professional and commercial projects. And then I guess just the growth of Linux and the success of it all speaks to the impact of what availability, accessibility, community, what it can do. The teamwork, obviously, since it's open source, it was kind of a concern that everybody would have access to it, everybody could modify it, and people could ruin it. But they have kind of banded together in teamwork and worked against bugs, and it's turned out to be more effective to have it open source than not, because even though everybody can access it, people are better. The people that are constantly reading through this code, they're better at debugging it and getting to the source of issues than the alternative if it weren't open source. And they would have all these processes and technologies trying to locate where things went wrong and fix it themselves. It's actually more effective to have it open source, which was interesting. So Linux kind of set the standard for security and trust with this open source. And then the future of Linux, technology is changing. The security isn't perfect. Obviously, it's not a perfect system, so there's still work to be done on security and containerization. And then speaking of technology changing, we're watching this happen with AI and machine learning. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Linux wants to incorporate AI techniques, so we'll see how that plays out. And cybersecurity, Linux plays a huge role in this field. And since the cybersecurity field is constantly changing, they need to stay up to date with new hacking techniques and new technologies. Linux also needs to evolve along with that. Growing adoption in desktop environments. Cloud computing, if it weren't for Linux, cloud computing wouldn't be a thing. They played a key role in the development, so as it progresses and evolves, Linux will also play a key role in its progression. And the growing market, it's expected to grow almost 30% by 2032. In 2030, 2023, the market size was $18.35 billion. So 30% is a significant amount. And then if we go back to the start and think about Torvald's quote, it's just a hobby. It won't be big as GNU. Linux has humble beginnings. Torvalds had no idea it would turn into this. He had no idea that it would combine with GNU and be what it is today. And then I found this quote. It's an efficient and reliable system that rarely crashes. And that's all thanks to hobbyist developers and this kind of silently mutual ideology of teamwork in the technology field. It's a unique quality. And this is what it led to. So it's kind of phenomenal how it all turned out. And these are my sources, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.